Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling CBRN threats. We've got a stack of articles here and reports, mostly from the February 2023 edition of CBRN World magazine. And let me tell you, there's some pretty thought-provoking stuff in here.
Yeah. What's really interesting about this issue in particular is that it really seems to capture this pivotal moment that we're in right now.
Yeah.
Where we're seeing the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine, obviously,
Mm.
but also just this rapid advancement of technology.
Mm.
And I think a growing awareness from everybody about just how vulnerable we really are to all these threats.
Yeah, for sure. And, we're not just talking about like these abstract threats, right? I mean, the war in Ukraine has really, I think, thrown a wrench into things in a way that I don't think a lot of people were really anticipating. For example, the magazine's editor, he opens with this really kind of stark observation about how the conflict has really shown just how readily available things like cheap drones, 3D printed weapons, these things are, and how easily they could be adapted for like chemical or incendiary attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really speaks to this broader point about the kind of the democratization of these threats, right? I mean, it's not just nation states anymore that have the capacity to inflict significant harm. Smaller groups, even individuals potentially, could get their hands on these technologies and perhaps more importantly, the knowledge to actually use them.
Right. And I mean, that's what I think makes that whole incident in East Palestine, Ohio, even more unsettling, because obviously that was an accident, right? That train derailment and the release of vinyl chloride. But it really drove home just how vulnerable we are to these kinds of events, whether they're intentional or not.
Oh, absolutely. And I think beyond just the immediate danger, the risk of exposure, things like that, I think East Palestine also really highlighted this other crucial aspect of CBRN threats, which is the importance of clear, accurate, and timely communication.
Yeah.
Because, in those early days, there was so much confusion, so much conflicting information, and that just fueled so much fear and mistrust, and rightfully so.
It's true. Yeah. And, that actually brings us to, I think, another really big theme in this issue, which is disinformation. The magazine dedicates a significant portion to unpacking how CBRN threats are being weaponized in the information space as well.
And that's really where things get, I think, even more concerning. Because in a lot of ways, disinformation can be just as dangerous as a physical attack.
Right.
I mean, think about it. If you're constantly bombarded with false information, about a chemical release, for example, that can lead to panic. It can hinder evacuation efforts.
Yeah.
It can even make people hesitant to trust, legitimate sources of information during a real crisis.
Right. It's like you're trying to fight a fire, but someone's constantly cutting the hoses.
Exactly.
You're dealing with a physical threat and an information war, simultaneously.
Exactly. And, we saw, I think, some pretty chilling examples of this in the magazine, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine. I mean, the sheer volume of false claims, manipulated images, all of that circulating online, it's staggering.
Yeah, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack of lies almost.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think what's even more concerning is that, these malicious actors are getting much more sophisticated. They're using things like deep fakes now. They're manipulating social media algorithms.
Right.
Really, they're exploiting people's, existing biases and fears. And they're doing it very effectively to sow discord, to undermine trust in authorities, to really create chaos.
Right. So how do we even begin to combat that? It feels like such an uphill battle, right? Against this tidal wave of misinformation.
It is. It's a massive challenge. But I think one of the key takeaways from the magazine and from a lot of the experts they interviewed is that we can't just play defense anymore.
Right.
We can't just be reacting to these things as they pop up. We have to be more proactive.
Yeah.
We have to be anticipating these narratives. We have to be countering them quickly and effectively.
So more of an offensive strategy almost for the information war.
Precisely. And that means investing in media literacy. It means building stronger partnerships, between governments and tech companies and researchers and journalists even.
Right.
To try to identify this false information quickly, debunk it, and amplify credible sources.
Yeah. It's almost like we need an information vaccine or something, right? To kind of build immunity against these harmful narratives.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Because just like a vaccine, it's about giving people the tools they need to recognize these threats,
right,
and resist them before they actually take hold.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. So we've got, these evolving threats, this constant battle against misinformation. It all sounds kind of daunting, to be honest. But, the magazine also does a good job of exploring how all of this is driving some incredible innovation as well
Right.
in the CBRN defense industry.
No, it's true. Necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing some really, really groundbreaking developments, in detection technologies,
Yeah.
protective gear, decontamination methods, you name it.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, there's this really fascinating interview with Dr. David Cullin, who's a VP at Teledyne FLIR, which, if you're not familiar, they're a pretty big player in the in CBR and defense world.
Okay.
And what I thought was really interesting about what Dr. Cullin had to say is that, it's not just about developing like the shiniest, most expensive, cutting edge technology. It's about making that technology actually usable,
Yeah.
making it more user friendly, adaptable, and accessible really to both military and civilian responders.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because it's one thing to have these amazing gadgets, but if they're not practical
Right.
or if people don't know how to use them effectively in the field,
Right.
then they're not going to do much good.
Exactly. And one area where we're seeing, I think, some really interesting advancements is in autonomous CBRN reconnaissance systems. So think like drones, for example, but equipped with sensors that can, detect and map chemical agents.
Oh, wow.
Kind of sci-fi movie stuff.
It does sound like something straight out of a movie.
Yeah.
But the reality is these technologies are rapidly becoming more sophisticated, more affordable,
Yeah.
and I think they have the potential to really revolutionize how we respond to these events.
Right. So instead of sending, a human being into a potentially dangerous situation, you can send in, essentially a robot.
Exactly. And these systems they can provide real-time information about the type of agent that's present, the concentration,
Mm.
which allows responders to assess the situation much more quickly,
Right.
make better decisions, and ultimately, hopefully, save more lives.
Yeah. Wow, it sounds like we're really on the cusp of a new era almost in CBRN defense.
It really does feel that way.
But I mean, I imagine there are still, challenges to overcome.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, technology is great, but it's not a silver bullet. And one of the things that, the Dr. Cullen emphasized as well is the importance of what he called, human-machine collaboration.
What is that? What does that mean?
So it's not about replacing humans entirely. It's about giving them better tools and information
Yeah.
to do their jobs more safely and more effectively.
So it's still a human-centered approach, even with all this like really amazing technology.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, it's about protecting people.
Right.
And that requires a deep understanding of both the technical aspects and the human factors as well.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. That makes me think though, with all this focus on technology, are we overlooking the kind of the human element of all of this, like the importance of training and preparedness and building resilience within communities even?
Yeah, no, that's a crucial point. And the magazine, actually, they delve into that as well.
Oh, wait.
There's a really, really powerful story about Dr. Donnell Harvin, who's from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and he's been doing some incredible work in Ukraine.
Oh, wow. What's he been up to?
So he's been on the ground there providing CBRN training to medical personnel, often in like extremely challenging conditions. I mean, the magazine mentions how he was even like conducting training sessions in bomb shelters
Wow.
during some of the heaviest bombing rates.
Wow. That's really putting yourself on the line to share that knowledge.
It is, and it really highlights, I think, the importance of building capacity at the local level.
Right.
Because in a crisis, it's often those first responders, the doctors, the nurses, the people who are on the front lines.
Right.
They're the ones who need to have the knowledge and the skills, not only to protect themselves, but to effectively treat and care for those who've been affected.
Yeah, it's about empowering those communities to be prepared for the worst, even in the midst of a conflict zone.
Exactly.
Wow.
And I think Dr. Harvin's story is not just inspiring, but it also highlights some of the real world challenges of providing this kind of training and support. For example, the magazine mentions how he ran into all these hurdles trying to get proper CBRN training equipment into Ukraine because of ITAR restrictions, which, for those who aren't familiar, those are regulations that control the export of sensitive technology.
Right.
And it highlights the complexities,
Yeah.
even with the best of intentions, there can be these roadblocks that make it difficult to get essential resources to where they're needed most.
Yeah, it's that old adage, right? no good deed goes unpunished, kind of.
Right.
But it really is. It's a reminder that it's not enough to just have the knowledge and the technology ourselves, but we need to find ways to share it effectively and responsibly with those who need it most.
Absolutely.
Okay.
A threat anywhere is a threat everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Especially in our interconnected world.
That's a really powerful point. And it makes me think about, as we go forward, what are the key takeaways from all this? Like, what's the so what that we should be thinking about as we delve deeper into this issue?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways for me is that CBRN defense is no longer just the domain of governments and militaries, right?
Mm.
This is something that affects all of us. And it requires a much more holistic and collaborative approach.
Right. So we can't just rely on like the old methods of deterrence or assume that, someone else is going to take care of it. It's
Yes.
it's really on all of us to be more aware, more prepared. We
Absolutely.
all have a role to play in building a more resilient world.
And that starts with staying informed, asking critical questions, engaging in thoughtful dialogue about these really complex issues. Because the more we understand the threats we face, the better equipped we'll be to actually mitigate them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about being proactive, not reactive.
Exactly.
And that all starts with knowledge, right?
Absolutely. And I think this issue of CBRE World provides a really valuable starting point for that conversation. It doesn't shy away from the complexities. It doesn't shy away from the challenges. But it also highlights, I think, the incredible innovation and the dedication of so many people who are working tirelessly to keep us safe.
It's a good reminder that even in the face of some pretty daunting threats,
Right.
right, there's always hope, and there's people out there who are really committed to finding solutions and creating a safer world.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's not about giving into fear. It's about, facing these challenges head on with knowledge, with courage, and with a commitment to actually working together to find solutions.
I like that. So as we continue our deep dive into this issue, I think let's keep that in mind. It's not just about, doom and gloom scenarios. It's about really understanding the risks, exploring the possibilities, and ultimately, finding ways to create that more secure and resilient future for everybody.
Yeah, I agree more.
All right, so we've talked about kind of the changing nature of the threats, the dangers of disinformation, the advancements in technology, the importance of training and preparedness. Um, what else did this issue of CBRNe World uncover? Because I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Oh, yeah, there's so much more to unpack. One article I found particularly insightful was an interview with a former U.S. Department of Defense official named David Lasseter. And he had a really interesting perspective on deterrence in the context of CBRN threats.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Oh.
Who's Mr. Lasseter, and what's his take on all of this?
So he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Countering WMD, so he definitely knows what he's talking about. And one of the things he pointed out is that for a long time, this idea of deterrence was based on this assumption that if you had these really robust defenses against a CBRN attack, that alone would be enough to deter adversaries from using those weapons against you in the first place.
Right.
The logic being, why bother if it's not going to be effective?
Yeah, no, that makes intuitive sense. It's like wearing a bulletproof vest.
Right.
If everyone knows you have one, they're less likely to shoot at you.
Right, exactly. But what Mr. Lasseter argues is that this idea of, capability as deterrence, it doesn't always hold up in the real world.
Oh, interesting. Why not? I mean, it seems like a pretty solid strategy on the surface.
It does, but he points to examples like, terrorist groups who are often willing to use chemical weapons, even if it's against a much stronger adversary,
Right.
even if it's unlikely to achieve their sort of quote unquote military objectives.
So even if it's not like a decisive victory in the traditional sense.
Exactly, because their goals are often very different from those of nation states, right?
Right.
They're not necessarily trying to win a conventional war. They're trying to spread terror. They're trying to disrupt society. They're trying to undermine public trust.
Right. It's about sending a message.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the military balance of power, but also the motivations and the ideologies of the actors involved.
Right. Which makes a lot of sense, because I mean, how do you deter someone who's willing to die for their cause, even if it means, inflicting horrific suffering on others in the process?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it really highlights the limitations, I think, of our traditional deterrence models.
Right. So if capability alone isn't enough to deter these attacks, then then what else needs to be considered?
Well, Mr. Lasseter argues that we need to be thinking more broadly about our defenses.
What does that look like, practically speaking?
Well, for one thing, he talks about the need to move beyond just focusing on specific agents, right? Like, okay, we're going to, develop a defense against sarin gas, or we're going to develop a defense against this particular strain of anthrax.
All right.
And instead, we need to be thinking about countermeasures that can adapt to a much more rapidly evolving threat landscape.
Which is a tall order, I imagine.
It is, because we can't just be fighting the last war. We need to be prepared for the next one, which may look very different from anything we've seen before.
So it's about agility, it's about adaptability.
Exactly.
It's about anticipation rather than just reaction.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that requires a real fundamental shift in mindset, I think.
From being reactive to proactive.
Exactly.
Okay.
And, and he also brought up this other point that I thought was really interesting, which is the need for transparency
Transparent.
when it comes to our defensive capability.
See, that seems a little counterintuitive, right? Wouldn't that just give our adversaries more information?
It might seem that way, but his argument is that there's value in signaling to your opponents that you're prepared, that you have the means to detect and respond to an attack, and that such an attack would be met with, swift and decisive action.
Right. So it's deterrence through transparency almost rather than through secrecy.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about demonstrating your resolve and your ability to respond effectively.
So it's a delicate balancing act, right? Between kind of keeping your cards close to your chest and showing enough to deter those potential aggressors.
It's a delicate dance, and it's a conversation that we need to be having, both at the national level and at the international level.
Because the stakes are so high.
The stakes couldn't be higher.
Yeah.
We're talking about potentially catastrophic consequences if these weapons are ever used.
Right. And that makes me think about another point that Mr. Lasseter raised, which is this idea of reassessing our critical national infrastructure, in light of what we've learned from events like the COVID-19 pandemic, for example.
Oh, that's huge, because the pandemic really exposed our vulnerabilities, didn't it?
It did, yeah.
I mean, it showed us just how fragile our supply chains are, how dependent we are on other countries for essential goods, and how quickly a global crisis can really disrupt our way of life.
It's true.
And those vulnerabilities extend to our CBRN defenses as well.
In what way? I mean, I see the connection, but can you flesh that out a little bit?
Sure. I mean, think about, just the essential supplies that are needed to respond to a CBRN event, right? Personal protective equipment, decontamination equipment, medical countermeasures.
Right.
Many of those items are manufactured overseas.
Okay.
Which means that in a crisis, we could find ourselves competing with other countries for those limited resources.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And that's not a position you want to be in.
No, not at all. That's like realizing during a blackout that your flashlight batteries were made in China.
Right. Exactly. And so, he argues that we need to be thinking much more strategically about domestic production, about stockpiles, about diversification of supply chains, to ensure that we can actually respond effectively to these kinds of crises in the future.
So building more resilient systems overall,
Exactly.
then reducing our vulnerabilities.
Precisely.
And it's not just about physical infrastructure either.
Right. It's about, our information infrastructure, our communication systems. It's about our ability to coordinate a response to maintain public trust during a crisis.
Which brings us back to that importance of transparency, right? And clear communication and public education, all the things we were talking about earlier.
It all ties together.
It does, and it really highlights the complexity of this issue. But even with all the challenges that we've been discussing,
Right.
I'm struck by Mr. Lasseter's kind of his optimism, I guess.
He does seem to have a hopeful outlook.
He does, and I think it stems from this belief that we can overcome these challenges, right?
Yeah.
If we're willing to learn from our mistakes, if we're willing to adapt to these changing circumstances, and if we're willing to work together to find solutions.
I think that's a message we could all use a little more of these days.
Absolutely. But it's important to acknowledge too that, this isn't just about, governments and institutions figuring this stuff out, right? It's about each of us taking some responsibility for our own safety and the well-being of our communities as well.
We all have a role to play.
We do.
Yeah.
And that starts with, staying informed, like we talked about, asking questions, having these critical conversations, because I think, as we've seen, knowledge really is power. And in a world of this much uncertainty, it's one of the best defenses we have.
Well said. Well said.
It's funny because, like, thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, right?
Right.
It's interesting to view it through this lens that we've been talking about, because in a way, it's like it exposed a lot of those vulnerabilities that we were just discussing,
Yeah.
like with supply chains and things like that. But on the other hand, it also showed us that, like, as a global society, we're capable of adapting and innovating pretty quickly when we need to.
I think that's a really important point because it's easy to kind of get bogged down in the doom and gloom scenarios.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about something as potentially catastrophic as CBRN threats.
Right. Yeah.
But I think, the pandemic, as horrible as it was,
Right.
it did show us that we can develop new technologies, we can adapt our supply chains, we can change our behaviors relatively quickly when we absolutely have to.
Right.
And it also, I think, highlighted the importance of international cooperation, scientific collaboration, public trust.
Yeah.
All of these things, which, as we've been discussing, are also really essential elements of any effective CBRN defense strategy.
Yeah, for sure.
It all ties together.
Yeah, it really does.
And I think, that's something that Mr. Lasseter, who we were just talking about, he emphasized that as well in his interview, this idea that, we need to be learning from our mistakes and not just, writing these after action reports, but actually implementing changes
Right.
to improve our preparedness.
So not just talking the talk, but walking the walk,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about taking a much more, I think, proactive, continuous improvement approach to CBRN defense.
Right.
Because, as we've been saying, these threats are constantly evolving.
Right.
We can't just rest on our laurel.
Right. Yeah. We've
Got
got
to be one step ahead.
Right. And that makes me think about something that I don't know that the magazine really touched on this directly, but it has been on my mind lately. And it's this idea of, like, the long-term psychological impact of all of this.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because we talk a lot about, like, the immediate physical dangers of a CBRN attack, right?
Yeah.
But what about the mental and emotional toll?
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. I think we often focus so much on the immediate physical harm that could be caused. But the reality is these threats, they also have this kind of this insidious way of getting into our heads, right?
Right.
And that kind of chronic stress, that low-level anxiety, that can have very real consequences for individuals and for society as a whole.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about, like, potentially increased rates of anxiety, depression, PTSD, substance abuse, people retreating into themselves. It can erode trust in institutions. It can, make people more susceptible to misinformation and conspiracy theories, like all of these things.
All of those things. And it can also, I think, just make it harder to have those rational conversations that we need to be having about these issues.
Right. Yeah.
Because if we're constantly operating from this place of fear and anxiety,
right,
it's much harder to think clearly, to make informed decisions, to actually work together to find solutions.
Yeah, and we're seeing that play out, I think, in so many different ways in society right now. It's like it's almost like we're all kind of on edge all the time.
We are, I think, to some extent.
It's exhausting.
It is. It's exhausting, and it's
Yeah.
not sustainable in the long run.
Right. Yeah. So how do we address that then? Like, how do we build that resilience, not just in our physical infrastructure and things like that, but also in ourselves?
That's a really big question, and I don't know that there's any easy answer.
Yeah.
But I do think it starts with acknowledging it, right? Like, we can't just pretend that this psychological impact isn't happening.
Right.
Or expect people to just get over it.
Right.
It's about validating those fears and anxieties while also providing people with accurate information, with coping mechanisms, with a sense of hope.
Right. Right. Because it's not all doom and gloom.
Exactly.
I mean, there are things we can do.
There are absolutely things we can do, and I think, part of that is fostering this sense of community, this sense of shared purpose.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Because we are all in this together.
We are. We're all on this ride together, whether we like it or not.
That's right.
And I think that's a really important message to kind of keep in mind as we talk about these things.
It is, and it's a hopeful message too, because it means that we're not powerless in the face of these threats, right?
Right.
We have agency, we have each other,
Yeah.
and we have, the capacity for human ingenuity, which has gotten us out of some pretty tight jams before.
That's true.
So I think, while it's important to be realistic about the challenges, it's also important to remember that there's always hope and there's always something we can do
I like that.
to make the world a safer place.
So, it's been a really interesting conversation so far, I think.
It has.
We've talked about, kind of the changing nature of the threats themselves, the role of technology, the importance of preparedness, even the psychological impact of all of this.
Yeah.
But there's one more kind of aspect of all this that I wanted to touch on before we wrap up. And it's something that I think kind of ties everything together. And that's this idea of ethical considerations in
Yeah.
CBRN defense.
Yeah. That's a crucial aspect, and it's often a very, very complex one.
It is. And it's something that's like I noticed it was touched upon kind of in various ways throughout this issue of CBRN World.
Yeah.
What specific ethical considerations, I guess, stood out to you?
Well, one that comes to mind is there's an article in here about the development of these new kind of more powerful chemical agents,
Hmm.
but that are intended for use in non-lethal crowd control situations, for example.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's this idea of how do you find that balance, that fine line between effective deterrence and something that could be, very easily misused, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And it raises all those tricky questions like at what point does a non-lethal weapon become effectively lethal,
Right.
especially if it's used improperly or against, vulnerable populations, things like that.
Right. Exactly.
And then there's the whole question of like who decides what proper use even is in those situations.
Right. Right. These are really, really tough questions, and
Yeah.
and oftentimes there's not easy answers. But I think the article does a really good job of highlighting, the importance of having those clear guidelines,
Hmm.
of rigorous testing, ongoing oversight,
Right.
accountability. All of these things are absolutely essential to try to mitigate the potential for harm.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then of course, there's the whole ethical debate surrounding gain of function research.
Right, where you've got scientists who are essentially manipulating, viruses or bacteria
Yeah.
to make them more transmissible or more deadly in a lab setting.
Right, right. And the argument for doing that type of research is that it can help us understand how these pathogens evolve
Right,
and potentially, help us develop better vaccines and treatments more quickly.
right. Get ahead of the curve in terms of preparedness.
Right. But then there's of course the risk that, these engineered pathogens could escape
Right.
or be intentionally released, and the consequences of that could be, really devastating.
Absolutely. It's a double-edged sword. There's no doubt about it. And that's why you have these, very, very strict regulations and protocols in place
Right.
for this type of research. But
Yeah.
as with, any powerful technology, there's always the potential for misuse or unintended consequences.
Right, right. Yeah, it's that old saying, right? Like,
Yeah.
we develop technology faster than we kind of develop the wisdom to use it responsibly.
Right, exactly.
Which I guess kind of brings us back to this point that we keep coming back to, which is like the need for these ethical considerations to be like front and center
Absolutely.
in all of these conversations that we're having about CBRN defense.
It can't just be about the can we. It has to also be about the should we.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's about finding that balance between like, scientific progress, but also like social responsibility.
Right.
And making sure that in our pursuit of security,
Right.
that we're not doing it at the expense of our values
Yeah.
and ultimately our humanity.
Well said. Well said.
Because at the end of the day, I mean, CBRN defense, it's about protecting people.
It is.
Right, not just from physical harm, but also from this kind of erosion of who we are and what we stand for.
I couldn't agree more. It's about creating a safer world
Yeah,
that's still worth living in.
right. Well said. Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today.
It has been a fascinating conversation, a very thought-provoking one, but
Mm.
an important one, I think, to be having.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, our listeners will come away from this with a much better understanding, not just of, the threats themselves, but also, the ways in which we're working to counter those threats. And most importantly, I think just the importance of these ethical considerations in all of this.
Absolutely. And hopefully a sense of, of empowerment, I guess, knowing that they too have a role to play in all of this, in
Yeah.
building this safer, more resilient world that we keep talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not just on the experts, it's really on all of us. So, until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged, everybody.
Absolutely. And remember, knowledge is power.
Yes, it is. All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you back here soon for another fascinating exploration of the world around us.
Take care, everyone.